Today we're looking at measuring national income and looking at gross domestic product and the circular flow of income. So macroeconomic goals. Congratulations, you're Prime Minister. What goals do you have for the economy as a whole? When we look at the major macroeconomic goals, and this would make sense for a Prime Minister to have them as well, we'd be looking at things like low unemployment, price stability, meaning low rate of inflation, and economic growth. Of course, we may have other macroeconomic goals, but those tend to be the main three. So you might ask, why are national income statistics gathered at all? Well, you can think of it like a report card and our government objectives being met. It can help governments determine appropriate policies to adopt. It can help make forecasts about the future, and then businesses can make forecasts about future demand. It can be for tracking performance of an economy over time, and we have to use real data for that, real being adjusted for inflation, which we'll talk about later. And it can be to evaluate the standard of living or quality of life for the population. And it can also be used to compare various countries. So we could compare GDP from one country to another and so on. So looking at gross domestic product, this definition is very, very key. It'll pop up an awful lot on IB exams. So GDP, or gross domestic product, is the value of aggregate production, so all the production being added together, of goods and services in a country during a given time period, usually a year. Now, if you were to leave out of the definition during a given time period, the IB, when a definition is worth 2 marks, you would get 1 mark because it would be not specific enough. Because if you looked at all of the value of goods and services being produced within a month for one country and compared it to goods and services being produced within a year for another country, it wouldn't make sense, the comparison. So you need to specify that it is a given time period. This is also very important, that GDP can be measured in 3 ways, and we're going to look at those. For what buyers pay for it, so it's known as the expenditure method, by the value of the goods and services produced, so that's the output method, and by the incomes earned, which is known as the income method. All 3 of these will equal each other. So if you recall the basic circular flow of income, we had two primary parties. We had households over here, and they sell the factors of production, so the capital, entrepreneurship, land and labor, and they buy products and services. Businesses are the other main party. They of course buy the factors of production from the households, and they sell products and services to the households. When we look at the households selling the factors of production, as we said, it's labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. And in return, they're paid income, wages, rent, interest, and profits. And that, of course, equals each other. The factors of production go to the factor market and then loop through to the businesses who then end up using this. The businesses, of course, generate the goods and services through the product market coming to the households. And the households pay for them as consumption expenditure, which becomes revenue for the businesses. And remember, all of the revenue that the businesses have are paid in turn for the factors of production to the households. So the income equals the expenditures. That's one of the key things for GDP as well. So thinking about GDP with the circular flow income. So for the economy as a whole, I already just made mention of that income is going to equal expenditure, which is also the value of production. It's the value of all those goods and services. And we can see that with the basic circular flow. In the economy, however, it consists of 4 sectors. So once we move away from the basic circular flow, we're going to look at a more realistic model. We have the households, which we looked at before in the basic circular flow, but then we also have firms buying capital from other firms, remembering that capital are tools and machines, things that you need to produce goods and services. You have governments as a player, paying to build schools, hospitals, bridges and roads, and you have the rest of the world where we're going to take exports and imports into account. There are also now 3 types of markets in our more expanded circular flow. As before, you have the resource markets, where the factors of production flow through. You have the goods and services market, where the products flow through from the firms. But also now we're going to look at financial markets, where, for instance, saving and borrowing can happen. Households and firms. Households sell the services, we talked about this, of labor, capital, land, and entrepreneurship, the sell, to firms in the resource markets. And the payments they receive for this, of course, are wages for labor, interests for capital, rent for land, and profits for entrepreneurship. When we add together all of this income, we call it the aggregate income, and all of that we refer to as Y. We don't use I because I is used for investment. Measuring aggregate income is the income approach to measuring GDP. So we would sum up together all of these things, and we would find the overall income, and that would equal the value of your GDP. Firms sell, of course, consumer goods and services to households. To produce these consumer goods and services, firms have to buy physical capital. So the total payment that households make for these goods and services is called consumption, and we're going to refer to it by C. The total payment that firms make to purchase physical capital, and they're purchasing it from other firms, is known as investment expenditure, and we call the investment I. Now please realize that when we talk about investment in economics, we're not talking about stocks and bonds. We're talking about buying capital, which are the things that you use to produce goods and services, tools, machines, and so on. Consumption and investment are 2 types of expenditure we sum to calculate GDP using the expenditure approach. But that's not the only 2 types of expenditure. There's going to be 2 more types that we're going to look at. Government expenditures. So governments buy goods and services called government expenditures from firms, and we're going to call this G. So government expenditures. Governments use taxes to pay for their purchases, and NT, or net taxes paid, equal to taxes paid to governments minus transfer payments. Now, transfer payments are payments which are made without having goods and services given in return. So what could be transfer payments? They could be social security benefits, unemployment compensation, subsidies, interest payments on government debt, and so on. When government expenditures exceed net taxes, so in other words, you are spending more than you're collecting in taxes, we know that the government has a budget deficit, which is financed by borrowing in the financial markets. If government expenditure is less than net taxes, then you have money left over, and we call it a budget surplus. And the rest of the world, the 4th kind of expenditure. Firms export goods and services to the rest of the world and import goods and services from the rest of the world. The value of, now we look at exports minus the value of imports is called net exports. And we can refer to it as X for exports minus M for imports. And it is calculated by subtracting imports from exports. Now I'd like to also emphasize here that if you're asked what is the net exports, we don't just say exports minus imports, because are we referring to volume? Are we talking about so many million oranges for exports and so many thousands of kilos of gold for imports, you'd have no sense of the overall dollar value at the end of the day. So that's why we emphasize and say the value of exports minus the value of imports. It's not the volume, it's the value. So the circular flow of diagram. The expenditure flows, which we looked at, are consumption, which is C, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So C, G, I, and X minus M. The income is the aggregate income, called Y. So we could say that Y equals C plus G plus I plus X minus M. The financial transfers are saving, net taxes, government borrowing, foreign borrowing, and firms borrowing. So looking at our model now of the circular flow of income with leakages and injections, we have what we had in the basic circular flow of our parties of households and firms, and they were dealing with each other of the households selling their factors of production to firms and firms paying for those with wages, rents, interest, and profit. We have consumer expenditure where consumers would buy the goods and services from the firms, but we know that the world is more complicated than just households and firms. We have other parties such as the government, and we have other countries. And we have other market other than the resource market and the goods and services market being the financial markets. So when money does not flow directly from households to firms like we looked at initially, we call these leakages. And we think, what could we do with money if we didn't buy goods and services? Well, we could have savings, that's a leakage. We could pay taxes, that's a leakage. And we could have imports buying from other countries, which is a leakage. So all of these are known as leakages. The savings goes into the financial markets, taxes go to the government, and imports go to other countries. Now, in return, if money comes back to firms, and I want to emphasize this very clearly, that did not originate from households, so they had to come from somewhere else. Where could they come from? Money could come from exports where they sell to other countries. It could come from the government spending on schools, hospitals, roads, bridges. It could come from firms buying from other firms the capital in terms of buying tools and machines and so on. So these are known as injections. We'll look at in a minute why that injections equal leakages. So the investment where firms have money coming from other firms comes from the financial market. Government spending, of course, comes from government, which they got from taxes. And the exports are paid for, the imports had been paid for by the exports. On all of this flows through other countries. So this is the more thorough circular flow of income. So we talked about how expenditure has to equal income. So the total amount that buyers pay for the goods and services produced is aggregate expenditure. Firms' revenues from the goods and services equal consumption expenditure plus investment plus government expenditures on goods and services plus net exports. So in other words, all the money that firms get, they get from consumers, from other firms with investment, from the government, and net exports. The sum of all of these four flows is equal to aggregate expenditure on goods and services. The total amount it costs producers to make goods and services is equal to the incomes paid for resource services. We looked at this in the basic circular flow. All of the money that was paid for the factors of production to households was in that model then equal to what households bought from firms for the goods and services. Well, now that we've expanded the circular flow, again, we can look at the total amount it costs to produce, so from the factors of production, and equal to the incomes paid, now coming from consumers, government, investment from firms, and net exports. So this is another sort of model of the households and firms. We had the goods and services flowing from firms, and the factors of production flowing from households to the firms. But we know that we had the expenditures on goods and services coming from households, but also from investment, from exports and government spending. In terms of leakages, we know that we had money coming out for wages, rent, interest and profits, but also savings could be a leakage, imports and taxes. The reason is, the income flow equals the expenditure flows, and the reason being is that everything a firm receives from the sale of its output is paid out as incomes to the owners of the resources that it employs. So, coming to something at the end of the day, you need to know this really, really well for the 2 years of this program, and much longer should you carry on in economics. So what does this formula represent? So Y is national income. So in essence, it's that wages, rent, profit, and interest. C is consumption. That's expenditure by households. I is investment, which is firms buying capital. G is government spending. And X minus M is net exports, being exports minus imports. So, or aggregate income Y equals aggregate expenditure. And note, net exports might be written either as NX or X minus M. I tend to use X minus M so that you're really reinforcing the fact that it's exports minus imports and not the other way around. So aggregate production of GDP equals the aggregate expenditure equals the aggregate income. So the first one, meaning the aggregate production, means simply the value of all the goods and services produced. So measuring national income 3 ways. We've talked about this: the income approach, expenditure approach, and output. So output measures the actual value of the goods and services produced in the economy, such as agriculture, mining being the primary sector, manufacturing the secondary sector, and services being the tertiary sector. Expenditure is the expenditure of households, firms, government, net exports. And income, the total income Y, is wages, rent, profit, and interest. All of these 3 methods will give you the same value for GDP. Injections and leakages. So we talked about this, but an injection is an expenditure that does not originate with households. The injections are investment, government expenditures, and exports. So these are things that, this is money that a firm receives from a party who is not households. And who could those parties be? Other firms, being for investment, the government, and exports. Leakage is income that is not spent on domestically produced goods and services. So it's money that's not going back to buy the goods and services. So if you're not buying goods and services, what could you do with your money? You could save them, you could pay taxes, or you could buy imports. And note that injections equal leakages in equilibrium. How investment is financed. Investment, which adds to the stock of physical capital. So you may be asked to define this in a data analysis on an IB exam. So often the desk copies do say investment is that which adds to the stock of physical capital. That's one way of defining it. And it's one of the determinants of the rate at which production grows. An investment can be financed by 2 ways: national savings and borrowing from the rest of the world. Now we're really going to emphasize this national saving component, especially when we go to developing countries. It's very hard for developing countries, for a lot of the population, to save because they're spending a lot of their money on what they need to get by in terms of food and housing and so on. So they tend to not have much of a savings, and this can be very problematic because it's savings which very much funds investment. And so we will look at what do developing countries try to do to overcome this savings gap. If the national savings isn't sufficient, the other alternative, or to add to that, is to borrow from the rest of the world. So we're going to look at national savings. It's the amount of savings by households and businesses plus government saving is called national savings. So we've got three parties. We have households, businesses, and government. All of that summing to national saving. Savings by household and businesses is called S, and government savings equals net taxes minus government expenditure. So here's the national savings. Savings by consumers or households and businesses plus net taxes minus government expenditure, meaning everything that's left over at the end of the day that a government has not spent. If the government has a budget surplus, the saving is positive. If the government has a budget deficit, meaning they're spending more than they're collecting in taxes, the saving is negative. Borrowing from the rest of the world. If we spend more on foreign goods and services than the rest of the world spends on ours, so in other words, if we import more than we export, we have to ultimately borrow from the rest of the world to pay this balance. So the rest of the world's saving finances are negative net exports and frees up an equal amount of national saving to finance investment in Canada. Conversely, if foreigners spend more on Canadian-made goods and services than we spend on theirs, so in other words, our exports exceed our imports, foreigners then have to borrow from us to pay the difference. So then we have part of the Canadian national saving flows to the rest of the world and is not available to finance Canadian investment because it's being used to so the rest of the world can borrow money from us to buy our goods and services. So a case study going back to 1998, and the reason we're going so far back is for decades and decades Canada exported more than we imported. Once we had the financial crisis of 2008, Canada turned around and then started importing more than exporting, and we have consistently since. So anyway, going back in time to 1998, we have Canadian investment was $176 billion. Our national savings was $189 billion, so we saved more than we needed for investments. And exports minus imports was $13 billion. So in other words, net exports was positive. So we know that if we're exporting more than importing, the rest of the world is going to have to borrow from us to pay for those additional goods and services that they're importing. So in other words, Canada lent $13 billion of its national saving to the rest of the world. So let's just recap that. Our national saving was more than enough. The national savings of $189 billion was more than enough to pay for the investments of $176 billion. So we know that Canada did not have to go out and borrow from the rest of the world to finance our investments. Furthermore, we know that we were exporting more than importing. And if we're exporting more than importing to the tune of $13 billion, then the rest of the world has to borrow that $13 billion from Canada to pay for those additional exports, which are there for their, in terms of them, are their imports. So let's fast forward to 2012, and this is now part of the time frame where Canada is importing more than exporting. We have Canadian investment was $433 billion. National savings was $381 billion. So we did not have enough money from our national savings to pay for Canadian investment. So we're going to have to borrow from the rest of the world. And X minus M, so net exports, was negative $36 billion. So net exports was negative. So Canada had to borrow $88 billion from the rest of the world. Now, why was it $88 billion? Number one, we had to borrow the $36 billion because we were importing more than exporting. But then we need to borrow again because the Canadian investment exceeded what we had from national savings. So we had to borrow that difference as well. The business cycle. When real GDP grows, and we've looked at this a few classes ago, the economy is in a business cycle expansion. When real GDP shrinks, and it has to be for 2 consecutive quarters, we could say that the economy is in a recession. So technically, if you're going to define a recession, you have to say when real GDP declines for 2 consecutive quarters. Now, what is a quarter? We have 12 months in a year, and 1 quarter would therefore be 3 months, and 2 consecutive quarters would be 6 months. Also, as real GDP fluctuates, so do employment and unemployment. And we know that if you're producing more goods and services, you need more workers. If you're producing fewer goods and services, you need fewer workers. So here's just an example of the fluctuations of the gross domestic product for Canada. And you can see here, 2008, we had the crisis, and it really hit in 2009, and you can see that GDP went way down. But even over these portions, you can see that there's constant sort of up and down in terms of the growth rate of GDP. So this isn't actually calculating the amount of GDP produced, it's calculating the growth rate. So as long as it's above 0, whether it's here or whether it's here, the GDP is still growing. But when it dips below, GDP is actually falling. And just to give you, anyway, we'll talk about prices and real GDP and nominal GDP, but just a bit of a picture of the past of how cheap things once were. So this leads us to the real versus nominal GDP. Nominal is in the current year prices, and real is adjusted for inflation. We'll make this clearer in a minute. So if nominal GDP increased in value from one year to the next, you wouldn't know if that's due to inflation or an increase in output or both. By using real GDP, where you're going to hold the prices constant and not let them change from year to year, whatever base year you've chosen, from that base year using the same prices to calculate the goods and services, then you can see if the output has increased or decreased. So here's an example. We'll take the year 2000. Very simple example. We have output being 100 units and the price being $20. If this is the base year, real GDP is $2,000, so 100 times 20. And the nominal GDP will also be 2,000 if this is the base year. So we're going to hold the prices constant, price at 20 when we're dealing with real GDP, and nominal will let it float to whatever the price is for that year. So let's look at the next year, fast forward. We have output remaining at 100 units. So we know that our real GDP will still be calculated at $20, so our real GDP should still be $2,000. But if we look at nominal GDP and we had inflation of 10%, then we know our costs have now gone from $20 to $22. If we calculate the nominal GDP, we take the 100 units times $22, and our nominal GDP would be 2,200. So if you were simply told that in year 2000, nominal GDP was $2,000, and a year later, nominal GDP was 2,200, and that's all the information you were given, you would not know whether you were producing more units or if there had been inflation or both. Whereas with real GDP, when we held the money constant at $20, we knew that if it went up to a higher amount, then the number of units must have increased. So let's look at one more year, 2002. Output now increases to 120, and there's no inflation. So real GDP is going to be the 120 times the original price in the base year of $20 being 2,400. Nominal GDP is going to be the 120, now at the higher price of $22, and the nominal GDP is 2,640. From the increase in real GDP, and only from the increase in real GDP, we know that there's now been economic growth, or an increase in GDP. So keep it real. That's basically what most data is presented in, so that you can make comparisons from year to year regarding output. Changes in measuring GDP. We can have inaccuracies, unrecorded or underrecorded economic activities, such as informal markets, such as do-it-yourself work, growing your own food. We could have illegal items, workers without permits that aren't included in GDP, or we could have external costs such as resource depletion and pollution. So an example of pollution, it's not reflected in the regular GDP figures, and the fact of resource depletion, your GDP might be looking great because you're taking out gold and copper from the ground, but if it's leaving you with fewer resources, you're actually a poorer country afterwards, especially if you're running up to the point where you're running out of these resources. So does GDP growth make us better off? Well, GDP does not take into account other quality of life concerns, such as leisure time, volunteer work, and so on. And you also have to look at the composition of output. If GDP includes a high amount of defense or capital goods, does this benefit consumers? Real GDP and economic welfare. Real GDP fluctuations can exaggerate or overstate the fluctuations in total production and economic welfare. So let's look at two scenarios. Let's say you're having in the business cycle a contraction and business activity is slowing down. What tends to happen is household production increases, you cook more meals at home, you perhaps do your own landscaping, cutting the lawns, shoveling the snow, and so on, and you tend to have more leisure time. When business activity speeds up in an expansion, the opposite tends to happen. Household production and leisure time decrease. So let's look at the concept of GDP per capita. So let's compare China with Canada. So if we're looking at in the year 2013 in current US dollars, real GDP for China is over $9 trillion, whereas in Canada it's closer to 1.8 trillion. So if we look purely at the overall output of China is nearly 5 times that of Canada. But if you look at the per capita GDP, so this is where you take the overall GDP and divide it by your population. We know, of course, China has a very large population, Canada much smaller. We see that the GDP per capita is roughly 6,800 for China, and for Canada it's almost 52,000. So when we start to look at it on the GDP per capita, and we link that in with being average individual income in Canada, it's more than 7 times that of China. So more than 7 times higher than in China. So that gives us a more accurate viewpoint of average income and standard of living. Thank you.